Urban Ontario and rural Ontario may belong to the same province, but they often face very different economic outcomes. That's one of the topics addressed by a new project called Ontario 360 that's coming out of the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. It's looking for evidence-based approaches to boost economic development in this province. And here for more, Sean Speer. He is Assistant Professor in Public Policy at the Munk School, and Weseem Ahmed, economic analyst and author with the 360 Project. And it is good to welcome you back to TVO. And you, for the first time, not only here, but on television at all, eh?
That's right, very
good
first
for
time.
you. Well, we are happy that you will make your debut here. Sean, you've been on this program before talking about Ontario 360. We had you last year, but for those who missed it, just bring us up to date. What is the project all about?
Well, first of all, thanks for having us on to talk about not just the most recent papers that we released, but the project overall. The Ontario 360 Project, which is housed at the Munk School, as you say, is a public policy initiative, but a bit different than typical ones. Instead of trying to anticipate what government policy makers are grappling with, we go to them. It's a collaborative two-way conversation. And so over the past several months, Steve, we've been working with members of the political arm of the government and members of the Ontario Public Service to ask them what issues are on their desk, what's keeping them up at night. And then we've gone about commissioning papers by expert scholars in different areas to try to inform and shape policymaking in the province as the government, that is, goes through its own deliberative process. And I can tell you that through that exercise, the issue that kept coming up over and over again with real intensity was this question of regional economic disparity in general and the urban-rural divide in particular. And so over the past several months, we've commissioned papers, including one by Weseem, on the urban-rural divide here in the province and what policymakers can do to try to catalyze economic activity in rural and economically distressed communities here in Ontario.
Weseem, I suspect everybody watching this or listening to this right now has their own interpretation of what the rural-urban divide means to them.
Right.
Why don't you tell us how you characterize it for the purposes of this discussion?
That's actually a good point that you bring it up, because there's no one definition as to what rural or urban means. So what I did for this study is we looked at essentially the county level across the province. And so to break it up into rural and urban areas, we use Statistics Canada's definition on that. So in a nutshell, what it is that any region that's part of a city or a census metropolitan area, to be more precise, is considered urban for this case. Of course, there's some mixing and matching here. It's not a strict definition. And any region that's not part of an urban center is considered rural. So this definition is actually based on labor inflows. So the more people who commute from rural areas into cities, the less rural that region is. And so what this does is it allows us to use, because it's based on StatCan's definition, we can use census data to really drill down and get to the core of the divide between urban and rural regions.
Let me make sure I get this then, because you know there are parts of Milton, for example, which is an hour and a half from here, which are very rural. There are parts of Hamilton, like Flamborough, for example, which are very rural. But they would not be considered rural for the purposes of your study, is that right?
That's right, because they would fall within the broader Hamilton or the broader GTA region.
I understand. Okay, all right. How much interest, you mentioned that you work interlocking with government, with public service. How much interest have they shown? Let's take the Ford government in specific. How much interest have they shown in what you're doing?
Considerable. Just recently in the fall economic statement of this government, real recognition of the regional economic disparity and the need for a policy response. The fall statement talked about efforts underway to try to identify ways to get at this issue. And so we're hopeful that our contribution is coming at the right moment and hopefully in the end will contribute to the government's thinking. What's interesting, Steve, is it seems to me the interest is really, that this heightened interest in the urban-rural divide really comes from two places. One, as Weseem's paper demonstrates, while we've always had regional economic disparity, it seems particularly accentuated due to a whole host of economic factors, and Weseem can talk about that. The second is small p political. It's just a self-evident fact that the Ford government has a disproportionate number of seats in rural parts of the province, and so it's intuitive that this government in particular would be sensitive to growing anxieties and growing economic challenges in rural Canada. You put those two, rural Ontario rather, you put those two things together and you see things like the government's commitment in the fall economic statement to try to extend investment and economic opportunity to all parts of the province.
Well, I know one thing they did was, and I don't think I've seen this before, they took the aviation tax off not anybody in the south, but people who lived in northern Ontario. I mean, is that the kind of thing that you guys are looking for, a distinction in policy, Weseem, between how governments treat rural versus urban areas?
There would have to be a distinction in the treatment because they're different. So policies that would apply to urban centers won't necessarily translate themselves well into rural regions. And even saying that, different regions across the province, speaking strictly on rurality here, have to be treated different. So rural regions in the south that are, let's say, close to Toronto or to London or Kingston, have different scenarios or situations than rural regions up in the northern part of the province.
Can I just elaborate on that
Please.
for a second, Steve? One of the strengths of Weseem's paper is it drills down into the headline data. So often we hear about how many jobs were created in the province of Ontario or what the economic output was in the province of Ontario. And for the purposes of producing public policy, that's not all that helpful.
Well, because it's all in Toronto and Ottawa and KW and nowhere else.
Exactly. And so by leveraging the work that Weseem has done to disaggregate, to unpack where economic activity and employment and investment is occurring, then policymakers are better placed to develop targeted policies to address the unique circumstances in different parts of the province. That may be a program around urban places, but it may also be a program around rural places. And I think that's the goal of this work at Ontario 360, to create an opportunity for the government to discern where these differences are and to develop a program that responds to them.
Let me follow up with you on that, because that is such an important point. When they talk about the unemployment rate being the lowest in 40 years, and when they talk about growth rates being okay, not fabulous, but okay, they're really talking about the Greater Toronto Area, they're talking about Ottawa, they're talking about the corridor, I guess, between here and Kitchener-Waterloo, and that's it. And the rest of the province really is not enjoying the fruits of those good numbers. Do you think policymakers at Queen's Park are aware of this and seized of this information?
I believe they are aware of this because that is where a lot of the interest in this project stems from. So a lot of rural Ontario during the election really fed into the decisions that Doug Ford and the Conservatives, and even on the federal side, into sort of the policies that were promised to rural regions of the province and across the country as a whole. So these sentiments are felt, at least they're known, and ideally they would be felt by the governments, by policymakers. And our job here today is to provide, twofold. One is to present sort of what's going on behind the scenes, and also to provide solutions in addressing these problems.
And I would just say that this is not a partisan observation either, and these trends are not even unique to Ontario. Prime Minister Trudeau created, for the first time to my knowledge, a Minister for Rural Economic Development in the last cabinet shuffle. An interest in what's referred to sometimes, Steve, as place-based policies. That is, policies to target places that are experiencing different economic circumstances, or in this case, economically distressed scenarios,
Right.
Growing increasing attention and interest all over the Western world, including the United States. So we're not unique, but in a lot of ways, Ontario's urban-rural divide is more marked than other places, and why it requires, in our view, a response from provincial policymakers.
I was just going to pull a bit of an audible here. Sheldon, would you mind, on the middle of page 2, do you want to bring up this graph here? And we got people listening to us on podcast who can't see it, guys. So I think we need to, apropos of what we've just been discussing, this is a graph that shows the employment gap in the province of Ontario over about the last, 10, 11 years. And Sean, maybe you could just sort of describe it in a bit of detail and take people through this. We've got Toronto, we've got other CMAs, census metropolitan areas, we got Ottawa, and we've got the rest of Ontario, and the squiggly lines are all really, really different. Go ahead, take us through it.
That's right, and this is the great work of Weseem. What he did, as we just talked about, was to drill down into the employment data to tell us what's happening, not just in the macro sense, but in a disaggregated way. And it's really striking. Since the recession in 2009, Ontario has created, on a net basis, approximately 865,000 jobs.
Which
that
sounds good.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
but 76% of those are in the Toronto area.
As that graphic indicates there. Look at that Toronto line, which is going up and up and up and up.
Another 12% is in Ottawa, and the remaining amount is all basically concentrated in census metropolitan areas. What's striking is that, remember, this is a net number. It accounts for the fact that rural parts of the province haven't experienced job growth. They've experienced marked job losses.
Fall off, yes.
And so I don't think there's a graph in Weseem's paper that more poignantly captures, I think, what we're getting at in this work.
And just so we're clear, other CMAs, other census metropolitan areas would include what?
So for example, Windsor, London, Barrie, Kingston, Thunder Bay.
Got it. And that line is, I mean, it's nudging up very much, but it's not dramatic, right?
Not dramatic. And as you mentioned, most of the growth has been concentrated in Toronto, Ottawa, Kitchener-Waterloo.
Now, the report also found that the median rural Ontarian is 6 years older than his or her urban counterpart. And I wonder what the implications are of that.
So this shows a real shift in demographics across the province. So there's a lot of sort of self-selection in terms of the exodus of people leaving rural parts of the province to urban centers for work, for education. And so what this does is it leaves behind the people who either cannot or do not want to migrate to more prosperous parts of the province, essentially urban centers. And a lot of times these are older folks. So an older rural population means that there are fewer people less likely to work, more in the retirement age. And then so you get the worker to retiree ratio start to decline, and it becomes more difficult to sustain economically a lot of rural regions across the province.
Let me just jump in. Why is that problematic? If you're a retired person and hopefully you got a pension or an RSP or something to draw on, or maybe you've sold your house and you've got some disposable income, why is that necessarily a problem for economic growth in the more rural parts of the province?
A lot of times, a lot of economic growth and sort of catalyzing comes from younger people with discretionary income who are willing to spend, for example, growing their families, buying cars, houses, etc. So once you reach a certain age, that spending starts to decline. And also thinking about it, you need youth to help take care of a lot of older residents, for example, in retirement homes, family members, etc.
What does the report say about the educational levels of those who live in urban versus rural Ontario?
We see a similar trend across the education spectrum. So urban Ontario, so CMAs, account for about half. So half of the people who live in CMAs have some sort of university degree.
Half the people who live in cities have a university degree.
Right.
Or college, I presume. Some post-secondary?
Right, some sort of, post-secondary higher education.
That's a pretty high number.
So half of graduate students live right here in Toronto. But as we go towards smaller cities and then entering rural Ontario, that number starts to decline. And what is really striking, Steve, is that by the time we reach the most isolated parts of the province, not only is that number a fraction of what it is in larger cities, but we see that there are more people who have dropped out of high school than who have completed it.
Why does that matter?
Well, it speaks to the point Weseem made about this exercise in self-selection. We're experiencing this process of sorting. So people with credentials, people with the aptitudes or skills that are valuable in a knowledge-based economy, they're going to places where the action is. And the people who remain back in rural places, as Weseem says, tend to be older people, tend to be people with less education, and in turn, tend to be the type of people who are not well-placed to participate in the knowledge economy, where so much new wealth and employment is coming. And so it's this process of self-selection, which is what's taking the regional economic disparity, which has been part of Ontario since Confederation, and really putting it on steroids. And I think it's that trend which is increasingly drawing the attention of policymakers.
So the divide gets bigger.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about how much foreign direct investment do rural communities get as opposed to urban communities? Foreign direct investment.
Foreign direct investment. So since 2003, the level of foreign direct investment has remained relatively constant at the macro level across the entirety of the province. But what we see is that in 2009, something interesting happens, in that there is a marked shift from rural areas into Toronto, Waterloo, Ottawa. And so what this does is it exposes the sort of inefficiencies in a lot of regions, or the efficiencies of urban centers, whichever way you want to slice it. And so the areas or the centers that are able to adjust to a knowledge-based economy towards more white-collar jobs have been benefiting from this economic transition that we've been seeing over the past 10, 20 years across the province.
Okay, we have, I think you have, I should say, very nicely laid out what the challenge is here. Here's the lay of the land. Now let's talk about some potential solutions here. Your report looks at something called opportunity zones. For those who don't know what they are, give us the handy-dandy definition.
Let me be brief. Opportunity zones are a policy experiment in the United States. At a time when we talk so much about political polarization down south, this happens to be a bipartisan experiment. The legislation that has led to the creation of the opportunity zones was co-sponsored by Cory Booker, a Democrat from New Jersey.
Running for president?
Yes, and Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina. And in effect, opportunity zones are a model that involves a series of tax preferences to try to pull investment into economically dispersed parts of the United States. The Opportunity Zone Framework has designated about 8,700 of these zones across the U.S. And for investors that put deploy capital to these 8,700 zones, they benefit from a series of tax inducements or tax preferences. While it's early days, the model looks interesting. Past efforts at regional economic development have not tended to be successful. And the Opportunity Zones model has sought to learn the lessons of those past failures. So it is market-driven, it's broadly flexible, it's mostly bottom-up. It's not about governments deciding which firms and which places are going to get money. It's about setting a framework and then letting the market to do what markets do, which is to pull investment into different assets and different projects. And as we say in the paper, well, it would be premature to call mission accomplished by any means. If a government is committed to trying to catalyze economic activity in these distressed parts of the province, Opportunity Zones looks like a promising model that deserves their attention.
Why do you think this might work here?
So something interesting about these opportunity zones is that it takes a real focused approach into specific regions. And some of the work I've done in previous positions in the past is looking at what are called clusters. So it's a relatively new concept here in Canada, but Europe and the US have started adopting these methodologies. And what it is in a nutshell is that we take 4 different actors. You take a talented workforce, we take government, higher education, and capital investment, and we really focus on specific regions and cater towards their advantages. So what that does is it provides a comparative advantage specific to one place that makes it harder for other places to compete in. So for example, no matter how rich or powerful Toronto becomes, it will never be as beautiful as Muskoka. And Muskoka knows that. So what they did is they took this sort of branding image and they created a food cluster out of it. So they create sort of a high-end, wine and dine sort of atmosphere, and they ship the products out across the rest of the province.
And it's working?
Seems to be working so far, yes.
Seems to be working. Okay, I don't want to crap on your enthusiasm here. However, I'm the only one at this table old enough to remember that there was a congressman from New York named Jack Kemp,
Yes.
who used to be, I think, quarterback with the Buffalo Bills.
Yes.
And he tried something, I think they were called enterprise zones or
Yes.
something. Now, we're going back 35 years, I think now, maybe even more. And I think the jury was pretty much out on whether or not that actually worked to do pretty much the same thing that what you're talking about right here.
Yes.
So why should you have any expectation that it might work this time when it didn't appear to work last time?
It's a great question, and I think we need to be transparent that there is a high probability that this ultimately proves itself unsuccessful. Remember, we're pushing against powerful market trends. The market's concentration of investment and opportunity in urban centers is not a case of the market malfunctioning. The market's doing what it does, which is allocating resources efficiently. Where the Opportunity Zones model, though, I think is promising is it sought to learn the lessons from failures like the enterprise zones, which in the end were too heavy-handed, were too narrowly focused, were too top-down. In effect, what the government is saying here, Steve, is if you choose to invest dollars in one of these roughly 8,700 zones in a wide range of assets with a pretty flexible policy and regulatory framework, you'll be eligible for these types of tax incentives. And what's striking is early on, the signs are positive. I'm cautiously optimistic. We've seen A number of opportunity funds spring up. So these are the vehicles through which people make investment. Some of these funds are traditional money funds. That is, that they're looking for high returns. Some of them have social impact investing mandates. The Rockefeller Foundation, for instance, has one. And so I think one of the strengths of this model is it ultimately is market-driven. It's ultimately counting on the self-interest of investors to do a lot of the heavy lifting.
I get you. So let me pick up on that as well, because I'm sure you guys saw I think it was front page New York Times a couple of weeks ago, a story on the fact that Michael Milken, former junk bond dealer from the 1980s, went to jail for a while. He's certainly, I think, resurrected his reputation since then by trying to get involved in some good works. And, the Times found that, coincidentally, a lot of the guys like Michael Milken who are pushing this idea in the United States stand to personally benefit significantly from the tax advantages that go along with this kind of program. Does that cause you pause?
There is concern about that, and as I was discussing with Sean actually a few days ago, that there is the risk of sort of targeting areas based on personal benefit, right, coming from the policy side of it. I'll let Sean elaborate more on that, but we need to essentially design these policies to benefit the regions and the people who live there, rather than having ulterior motives stemming from government, whichever side of the spectrum that we sit on.
It's worth responding directly to that question, though. These allegations are obviously concerning. In a nutshell, what the charge is that a zone in Nevada was designated even though it didn't meet the economic thresholds. Remember, these zones are supposed to be underperforming parts of the United States, according to fairly clear thresholds.
Empirically provable data.
Exactly. And the allegation here is that one managed to get designated in Nevada in the interest of a particular investor. And if that's true, that's obviously a concern. But I think on balance, research by different think tanks and so on have determined that most of the 8,700 zones are justified. These are places in real need. And so I wouldn't want one bad example to kind of harm the overall.
Fair enough. Do you know, Sean, whether or not the Ontario tax code is even set up to be able to promote an idea like this?
It's a great question. The short answer is no, and that's because of the integration of tax administration between Ottawa and Queen's Park. It would be very difficult for Ontario to simply transplant the Opportunity Zones model in the U.S. here in the province. It would require cooperation with Ottawa. But I think that's worth pursuing. I mentioned earlier that the Trudeau government created, for the first time, a Minister for Rural Economic Development in the last Parliament. So the government in Ottawa is sensing the same sentiments or concerns in rural parts of Canada as the Ford government is expressing, or hearing rather, here in the province of Ontario. So this might be an opportunity for collaboration. In the event that it's not, though, the paper sets out some alternative proposals that Ontario could go it alone. But I think for a whole host of reasons, the first step ought to be to engage Ottawa. I think this is an opportunity for nation building that can cross partisan lines, just as opportunity zones have in the United States.
Well, they have all the incentive to want to put a little water in their wine up there now, don't they?
Yes.
I mean, given the results of the last election.
And may I just make the other reason they have common interests here, Steve, is that the extent to which the Opportunity Zone model harms the Treasury, it's in the foregone revenues that would come from capital gains taxes. But first of all, it requires no new government expenditure. And even those revenues are a bit theoretical because this capital is sitting in unrealized capital gains. In effect, what you're doing is pulling it into the marketplace. So for two governments that are, one, concerned about uneven economic activity between urban and rural parts of the country, and two, are both running fiscal deficits, this strikes us as a win-win opportunity. And at worst, it doesn't work. And it seems to us, given the extent to which we're observing this growing bifurcation, it's worth giving it a shot.
Weseem, let me do one last question to you, and that is, people in Northern Ontario are certainly well aware we have a Northern Ontario Heritage Fund. There is a Rural Economic Development Fund. I think there may be an Eastern Ontario fund as well. It's not like governments haven't tried.
Right.
Now, admittedly, they're running those things, and that's different from what you're recommending here. But it's not like ideas to promote rural development haven't been tried before.
Absolutely.
So why do we need this when there's already so much in place already?
Those funds you mentioned, it's actually good that you brought this up. Those funds, what they do is they might not necessarily incentivize new capital into these regions, but what they would do is that someone who is already located in these regions, who is already planning on investing or opening up some shop or business, would be taking this money anyways.
And they may not need it.
And they may not need it.
Yeah.
So Sean hinted at this earlier, is that what these opportunity zones do is that they take unrealized capital. So money that's sitting aside, that's not being used efficiently in the market, pulls it out and puts it into these distressed regions.
So that's a distinction.
Right.
Good. Gentlemen, thanks for coming into TVO tonight and describing it for us, and we will watch with interest. Maybe we should reconvene this gathering in a year or two and see whether or not any of the seeds you've planted have grown into sprouts or flowers or even trees. Who knows?
Thanks for having
Thanks
me.
a lot.
Thanks so much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.